The Tom Woods Show, episode 2184.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey folks, if you've decided it's best not to have your kids educated by people who have declared war on you, then consider the self-taught Ron Paul curriculum. Instructors like me will give your kids an unfair advantage and an education you and I could only have dreamed of. But make sure you join through my link, because only there do you get my $160 worth of free bonuses. My link is ronpaulhomeschool.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Our old friend Tom DiLorenzo is with us today. Tom, of course, is the author of a zillion books. You've probably read some of them. He is recently retired as a professor of economics at Loyola University in Baltimore. But the reason we're talking to him today is that he has a brand new book out just today, and it's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. Now, you may recall, dear listeners, that back in 2004, your host here inaugurated that series for Regnery Publishing with a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. Well, the series, 18 years later, is still going strong, and with one of the best possible people to be writing the latest volume, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. So, Tom, welcome back.
Great to be with you again, Tom.
So, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. That is a great thing for a couple of reasons. The first one is I'm glad to see the series isn't dead. Seems like they went quite a while without releasing any new entries in it, and I have I wouldn't say I have a proprietary interest in the series, but I did write the first one, and I'd like to see it carry on. But secondly, to have you do it. There are so many people who would have done a mediocre job on this. You know, let's not mention names. I'll mention one name, like the Stephen Moores of the world would have just not written a good book. This would just not be good. It would be conceding 35% of the argument to the other side. This doesn't concede anything to anybody. So if this book then is not a replacement for or modeled after Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, how would you describe it?
Well, I was an economics professor for 41 years, recently retired from my university job. This is my 18th book. And so I put to work some of my experience in teaching and researching to write a book that's not just another version of Economics in One Lesson or supply and demand and basic economics. And in keeping with the Politically Incorrect Guide series, I took on a lot of the left-wing market failure segment of the economics profession. And because I've been doing that in my research and in teaching for decades, and also the whole business of government failure, I took that on. So yes, I do explain what the free market is. And there's a chapter on the worst economic idea in the world, which is letting politicians control prices. A lot of different things there's a chapter on the nirvana fallacy about sort of the dishonesty of economists and creating some sort of utopian nirvana theory of competition. They called it perfect competition, and then comparing the real world to that and proclaiming that the real world fails, that is markets, fails everywhere, and that perfect politics needs to be invoked to correct all these market failures. I have several chapters on that, which is sort of atypical, and I explain just why it is that pollution was orders of magnitude worse under socialism and is under socialism than capitalism. And final chapter on socialism, how it destroys your economy, impoverishes you, and deprives you of your freedom. Who would ever have thought that? So that's a little different than your typical Economics in One Lesson book.
Yes. And that's all very important. I want to spend a little time on that perfect competition stuff in a minute. I do want to say I recently did a series of 3 episodes on the Fed. So we'll leave that. We're going to assume the listeners are pretty well informed on that. And then on basic concepts of economics, I think most people who listen are pretty informed on that. But this perfect competition model is just so weird. I'm trying to think of the name of that book, very, very little known, that Rothbard liked from like maybe the early 70s, that had a chapter on the perfect competition model that just blew it up for me completely, that I was completely convinced this was a stupid theory. This perfect competition model makes a series of assumptions that are, let's say, crazy, unreasonable, certainly not assumptions that you would make and then create a model based on these assumptions and then compare that model to the real world and find the real world wanting. It's almost like they created it so that the real world would be found wanting, so that they would have some pretext for intervening. Can you talk about when did this so-called perfect competition model, does Joan Robinson have anything to do with this? Does this go back to the 30s? When does it emerge, first of all?
It did emerge around the 30s. Before that, anybody who had a claim to be an economist, especially an academic economist, and there weren't many, there were a dozen people really at the turn of the 20th century, thought of competition like the Austrians do as a dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship with vigorous price cutting, advertising, corporate mergers to try to achieve economies of scale, all these things, which is why I cite one of my articles in an academic journal called Economic Inquiry from way back in 1988, I think it was, where a co-author and I surveyed the views of economists at the time that the first antitrust law was passed in 1890, and they were uniformly against it because they saw competition as, like the Austrians, as dynamic, rivalrous, and they saw prices going down, and they saw the invention of all these new products, and for decades prices were going down, and they thought, well, this is all good, it's all good, and then the theory changed. By the 1930s, the economy didn't change, the theory changed, and they said, oh, no, wait a minute, competition should mean homogeneous products, everybody produces the same thing, everybody charges the same price, everybody knows everything, so there's no need for advertising, and businesses are assumed to know how to minimize costs and maximize profit, and there's free and costless entry into every business. And that would be a perfect market. And that gave rise to all these hundreds, maybe thousands of publications on market failure, really based on the idea that markets fail to meet this crazy utopian fantasy of perfect competition. And it always struck me as so patently dishonest. And then it was Harold Demsetz, the old University UCLA economist, Harold Demsetz. In 1969, he wrote an article in response to a statist economist named Kenneth Arrow, a Nobel Prize winner. And he coined the phrase nirvana fallacy. And all of this market failure literature, which was huge, it's like dominated the field of economics from the 1950s to the 1980s. And he said, well, they're creating this definition of nirvana or heaven on earth. And they're saying, look, the real world on the earth is not like that. Therefore, we need to condemn the real world. And it's just dishonest. And so I devote several chapters to taking this on and explaining this. For example, Paul Samuelson, who wrote the famous Principles of Economics textbook that basically monopolized the whole world book market, textbook market, for 40 years, beginning in 1948, he taught his students that because of this theory, the only real competition there ever was probably something like cotton and natural gas. Everything else is some sort of monopoly, which is ridiculous on its face, but that's what students were taught for decades.
Yeah, so if in some way the real world does not conform to this crazy theory, then that means that there can be grounds for intervention. So of course they love a theory like this for the same reason they love Keynesianism, for the same reason they love climate change, they love COVID. It's the same kind of thing. By the way, the book I was thinking of was Milton Shapiro's book, Foundations of the Market Price System.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, because apparently Rothbard really liked it, and it has a great chapter on perfect competition, just laying bare all the absurdities of it. So does this mean, for instance, if there's such a thing as, let's say there's two kinds of breakfast cereal. Now let's leave aside the health issue involved. That's irrelevant. Let's say there's a generic brand and then there's a brand that has a toucan on the box. But it's exactly the same cereal, but I have a brand loyalty because of the toucan on the box. And so I prefer to buy that. Would that be viewed as a violation of perfect competition? And therefore there's something wrong with this market?
Well, yeah, you mentioned Joan Robinson, the British economist. She and another British economist, Edward Chamberlain, both wrote basically the same book at the same time in the 30s on so-called monopolistic competition. And they basically said, well, yes, you can have an industry with 1,000 competitors. So there's, many firms. That's one of the assumptions. And on the outside, it looks competitive. And they are actually producing an almost identical product, physically identical, cereal in your example. However, if a little bit of advertising can make consumers think that the product is differentiated, at least mentally, not physically, but in their minds, well, then that creates a monopoly because only that product has the toucan on the box, and therefore its monopoly And then there's this list of horrible things that happen with monopoly. They restrict production. They create something called a deadweight loss, and therefore they need to be regulated and controlled and so forth. And this got carried away so much that in the 70s, the Federal Trade Commission hired an economist from Harvard named Scherer. He was their expert witness in a case against these cereal companies, General Mills, General Foods, and Kellogg's, who had differentiated their cereal. And he came up with a theory that he called shared monopoly. He said, yes, there's no reason to believe that they have a traditional monopoly, but these three companies have a high market share and therefore guilty as can be. That's all the evidence we need. They have a high market share. Well, of course, it turns out that they had a high market share because people like their products more than they like plain, boring old cornflakes, as far as that goes. But it is true that human beings differentiate a product for whatever reason. Well, that's a good thing. Businesses are catering to their preferences. I read an article not too long ago that female wine purchasers overwhelmingly go for bottles of wine that have cute little animals on them. And so the wine business produces mediocre wine and they'll put a kangaroo or something on the bottle. And women especially like that, according to this article, is one of the business magazines. That's their opinion as consumers. And, consumer sovereignty is an important concept in economics. And it is different in the minds of the consumers.
I want to continue kind of along this line of politicians overriding consumer decisions, because that really is the key to this whole thing. So you have a very brief section in this book, but I know you've talked about it at greater length also, about industrial policy, which seems to be coming weirdly into vogue once again, whereby politicians would choose quote unquote winners and losers. Like they'll see, supposedly for some reason, they have the ability to see an up and coming technology that ought to be invested in, and that they'll do a better job of this than capital markets or something.
Yes.
What can you say about that?
Yeah, well, that was in vogue in the 80s when the left wing of the economics profession was pointing to Japan and saying, well, Japan is doing well, but we're in stagflation here in the early 80s, late 70s. And they claimed that, well, Japan is doing better because of industrial policy. They empowered politicians to pick winners and losers. But if you look at the actual truth about Japan at the time, the Japanese government advised the Japanese car industry in the post-war era to produce one national car. Don't produce Toyotas and Mitsubishis and everything else, one national car. And Sony, the founder of Sony, when he got into the transistor radio business, he decided that after World War II, Americans were buying all these big houses and they might like to hear music upstairs as well as downstairs. And he had a gadget that could do the trick. But the Japanese government said, some idea, we're not going to give you the foreign exchange that you need to get into the business. Well, they eventually did, but that's the kind of planning they did. I quote a study that was done by the Cato Institute years ago by Katsuro Seiko, a Japanese economist, showing that actually, yes, it's true, the Japanese government at the time was subsidizing some Japanese industries, but it turned out to be 0.1% of gross domestic investment. So it was almost nothing. And most of that went to their worst industries like agriculture. Their agriculture industry was at the time more centralized and more socialist than ours was and is. And it was a debacle. And mining, their mining industry was terrible. So the areas where they did intervene were terrible. And the advice they gave was even worse. Telling Toyota, produce one national car, don't differentiate your product. One of the key players back in the 80s was Robert Reich. I don't know if he pronounces his name Reich or Reich, but he wrote several books about industrial policy. And then the whole thing blew up in his face when the Japanese economy tanked in the 1980s and ours took off, just the opposite of what they were proclaiming. But he's one of the ones who's back now, 30 some years later, singing the same tired old tune. But it all comes down to the fact that these people are socialists. They will always be socialists. They will never change their tune. They apparently hope that there's a new generation out there now who is unaware of these facts, and maybe they can hoodwink them into accepting their socialism now. But that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics, in the way I did, to make it available, some of these things like this available to the younger generation.
Hey folks, quick message from Old Woods here. If you are looking to add Bitcoin to your retirement account and thinking about the long haul, then the best and easiest way to do that is with BitTrust IRA. BitTrust IRA helps you seamlessly and securely add cryptocurrency to your portfolio. It stores your private keys in nuclear bunkers with military-grade encryption. They have a 24/7 trading platform with no minimum investments and unlimited trades, plus a team to help guide you along the way if you have any questions. They also offer the lowest trading fees in the industry. I've often said that if Bitcoin is ever to gain more widespread acceptance, it's going to have to be more user-friendly, and BitTrust IRA could not be easier to use. So go to bitrustira.com/woods today to learn more. And for a limited time, BitTrust IRA is waiving the sign-up fee for Tom Woods Show listeners, a $50 value. That's bitrustira.com/woods, bitrustira.com/woods. I think in a way I may be asking about some of the toughest or most complicated concepts in the book, but again, only because I feel like with you and with others, we've covered so many of the other topics. I want to get in a little bit more deeply. So let's talk about externalities. I've had a couple of people on to talk about externalities. Externalities are also an excuse given for why, of course, we need government involvement, because this is a form of market failure or quote unquote free riding. And on the surface of it, the logic of it can sound plausible. There are things that happen in the market whereby third parties get harmed and there's no allowance for this. And so we need to introduce some kind of restrictions to prevent these third-party harms or whatever it is. How should we think about so-called externalities?
There's a long history, of course, of individuals solving all kinds of problems created by externalities. Most human beings are problem solvers. And the Political Economy Research Center in Montana, the home of what's called free market environmentalism, they have a program on what they call enviropreneurship. And they've been working for decades with business people, ranchers, farmers, who are involved in solving environmental issues without invoking government. And so there's a whole literature now, and there's whole decades of experience in history of solving problems without bringing government in. That's one point. And on the theory of externalities, it came about around the turn of the 20th century, almost the same time as the theory of perfect competition became popular in the economics profession. And it has a certain logic to it. But one test of it that I've done in some of my writings is, well, if it's true that pollution problems are primarily created by unregulated free markets, what would you expect pollution to have been like in the Soviet Union, where the government laid claim to all resources? There were no legal free markets at all, and government regulated everything. You would expect the environment there to have been pristine. But of course, exactly the opposite is true. And it was the worst environmental hellhole on earth in the communist countries. In my book, I tell story after story that we learned right after the collapse of socialism in the late 80s and early 90s about the terrible condition of the environment in those places. And even in so-called democratic socialist countries like Mexico, Mexico has horrible pollution problems because of their socialist government. And they have democracy, they have elections there. And so, socialism has a horrible record from an environmental perspective. In my view, it calls into question the whole theory that unregulated free markets are the problem there. And also, I write about how so-called externality problems have been greatly exaggerated by economists, if not just plain old fabricated by economists. And I talk about this, at least among academics like myself. There's sort of a famous article in the literature by a man named Stephen Chung. It was in the Journal of Law and Economics some years ago, where the claim was all these textbooks, even books written by Nobel Prize winners, and a classic example of an externality problem was bees and apple orchards, where the bees are needed to pollinate the apple orchards. And that was said to create a positive externality, a positive benefit for the apple orchards. And then the apple orchards would feed the bees. So there was sort of a reciprocal positive externality. But all these big shot economists, Paul Samuelson included, wrote in their books that there's no way of making this happen in sufficient amounts, though, because there's no mechanism where the farmer can pay the beekeeper for his bees, or the beekeeper can compensate the farmer somehow for the food for the bees. And so it's market failure once again. And they came out and said the government needs to subsidize beekeepers as a result of that. Well, Stephen Chung did something that Harvard and MIT economists apparently never do. he got up out of his swivel chair at his office at the University of Washington and looked around outside. And he was in Washington State, sort of the epicenter of the Apple industry and Apple business in America. So he became an expert in the Apple industry and the beekeeping business. And lo and behold, he found that for generations, they had worked out very sophisticated contracts where the apple orchard owners would pay the beekeepers to bring their beehives at certain times a year to pollinate the apples. And they had all kind of things written in there like, we will give you 2 weeks warning if we're going to spray pesticides on the apple trees so your bees aren't unharmed and things like that. And so the pursuit of profit in the free market solved that problem. Another example the establishment economists used was lighthouses. They said, well, there's no way to make ship captains pay for the benefits of having a lighthouse so that they could avoid crashing on the rocks when they approach the shore. And therefore, government needs to be a monopoly in the provision of lighthouses. Well, Ronald Coase, who also won the Nobel Prize in economics, by the way, he did the same thing Stephen Chung did. He got up off his swivel chair in his faculty office and did a little research at the library. And he found out that private enterprise had run lighthouses in England for hundreds of years before the government decided there was money in it and took it over. So there are a great many fables like this. At the time when Alexander Hamilton was complaining that there's a free rider problem in building roads and canals and we needed government to finance road building, private enterprise and private investors had already built thousands of miles of private turnpikes all over the eastern seaboard of the United States. This is in the early 1800s. And I talk about these sorts of things in the book, which take on the market failure theory.
I can't remember. I think you're the one who told this story. But years ago, now this isn't related to externalities per se, but it is related to your point about actually getting up out of your chair and going out and looking at how things have worked in the real world. And I think it might have been a job interview where the interviewee needs to give some kind of academic presentation to the committee for them to see if his presentation style and his content are any good. And he gave some presentation about the hamburger industry, which he had modeled,
Oh, yes.
right? And so there was somebody on the committee who had some experience with the hamburger industry, says this bears no resemblance to the hamburger industry at all. And it was almost like the guy couldn't even understand the objection. But look, my model.
Yeah, that was my story. And that happened in graduate school. I was in a PhD program in economics at Virginia Tech. And my professors, James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, had a weekly seminar. And they would bring professors in. I think this one was an Ivy Leaguer. I think he was a Harvard professor. And I remember his name was Professor Ung, N.G. That's what his name. And in those days, the typical economics department seminar, some guy would show up and he would fill 3 or 4 blackboards up with mathematics, a mathematical model, all done by computer today. But back in those days, some poor sap had to sit up there and sweat bullets and go through all this math of a mathematical model. And I had a model of the hamburger industry. And so as a graduate student, I'm once again bored to death sitting through this and watching all this. And it was Gordon Tullock, the late Gordon Tullock, my old public choice professor, who stood up and said, but Professor Ung, this is not anything at all like the hamburger market. And Professor Ung said, but I'm not interested in the hamburger market. I'm interested in my model. And that's the attitude of these economists. So many mainstream economists have, that they're interested in their model. They're interested mostly in impressing their peers and how clever they can be in manipulating a mathematical model. And they don't really care if it's realistic or not. Another good example is Paul Krugman once pontificated and said, I don't believe anything in economics that is not the result of a mathematical model. Oh. And I think I blogged somewhere about it saying, well, that would eliminate every one of his New York Times columns, wouldn't it? Being a serious thing to consider.
Yeah. So you have a chapter in here on the income tax. Now, everybody normal people dislike the income tax, and no one wants to pay it. But there are other problems with the income tax apart from the fact that it involves taking your money. It does other kinds of damage that might not be as evident to people. So what would be an example of that?
Yeah, I didn't want to just write another chapter about the income tax and the economic effects, because there's a big literature on other effects of the income tax they're very important and interesting. And so one of the things the income tax did when it came in was to greatly centralize power. And I think it was Felix Morley, an old right author, wrote a book called Freedom and Federalism. And he pointed out how During the Civil War, before we had an income tax, there was a conscription law, but the government did not have the resources to hunt down the draft evaders. And there was massive desertion and massive draft evasion. But now with the income tax, it was a cinch. They had all the money in the world to do that sort of thing. So it tremendously empowered the government. Frank Chodoroff wrote this great book, The Income Tax, Root of All Evil. And among the things he pointed out is the income tax drew the public's allegiance away from local governments into Washington, D.C. It causes people to have less control over the government. You have more control over your local mayor than you do a senator or president, that's for sure. And it made people subject to the whims of federal politicians, and it causes state governments to lose their autonomy. So that's sort of a death knell to federalism there. And it enabled the federal government to bribe and threaten state governments and get them to do whatever they wanted them to do. And most importantly, I'll repeat myself, destroying the system of federalism that was established by the founding fathers. That's basically what it did. And also it established the precedent that we, the government, own all of your income, that you now work for us, and we, the government, will tell you how much of your income you get to keep by setting the income tax rate. So it essentially nationalized everybody's income, is what Frank Chodoroff said. And it's true. If the government wanted to declare a 90% tax rate, which it did during World War II, by the way, it can and it will, and it can do it again. And so it nationalized everybody's income and made us all slaves, so that Tax Freedom Day now is mid-April. We all work for at least a third of the year just to pay taxes, federal, state, and local taxes. And that's not counting the implicit tax of government regulation that makes everything more expensive.
All right, Tom, there is so much more we could discuss in this thing, but number one, I want people to go read it. And number two, with this being the release day and the release week of this book, you're slammed with interviews, so I don't want to be selfish with your time. So I will conclude by urging people to check out The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics, part of a wonderful series of politically incorrect guides released by Regnery Publishing. I have the book linked on our show notes page for today, which is tomwoods.com/2184. Well, this is a great project for you to have done in retirement. Even though you were able to churn out books when you weren't retired, this is a nice project while you're sitting on the beach, bringing together some of the material you've worked on for 40 years.
You can't play golf every day. You've got to have something to occupy your time with. And you, Tom, of course, are the founding father of the Politically Incorrect Guide series. And so I'm just following in your footsteps.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And it's funny, we've had a bunch of our, people in our camp who have published in that series. That's partly because I give author recommendations when they ask me for different projects, because it's very possible. You could easily imagine a series like this being dominated by neocons.
Yes.
And there is a handful of neocons in it, but there are way more good people, like a disproportionate number of good people given our small numbers in this series. So that makes me happy. So the latest one is yours, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics, released just today. Everybody go pick it up. And thanks so much, Tom.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Take care.
All right, folks, that's going to do it for today. Remember, the school year is coming up. And if you're thinking of joining the self-taught Ron Paul curriculum, you want to join through me, because only through me do you get a whole bunch of bonuses. And why would you not want the bonuses? They're really, really great bonuses. Signed, personalized book and membership at my Liberty Classroom site. I got lots of bonuses for you. All you got to do is join the Ron Paul curriculum through ronpaulhomeschool.com. See you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.